In this section, we'll look at the remainder of the Johnson administration's record in Vietnam up to 1968 and see how this period was the period when it was sort of the famous quagmire when America's presence increased dramatically and America sort of found itself in a horrible war. First, on February 6, 1965, which is after the Gulf of Tonkin resolution, the Viet Cong attacked an airfield at Pleiku and a nearby helicopter base. And included in the attack was a U.S. Army barracks where 9 U.S. military advisors were killed and 5 aircraft were destroyed. Johnson decides that he was going to retaliate by ordering the first U.S. bombing of North Vietnam, not simply a tit for tat of bombing like the Gulf of Tonkin incident, but regular bombing. He said, we kept our guns on the mantle and our shells on the cupboard for a long time now. I can't ask our soldiers to go out there and continue to fight with one hand tied behind their back. And so, Pleiku became the reason for an escalation. After Pleiku, the U.S. military was flying bombing missions over North Vietnam regularly. In April 1965, for example, South Vietnamese and American pilots flew 3,600 sorties against North Vietnamese targets. The new 1965 airstrikes were significant in another way. They led to the first ground combat troops in Vietnam. General Westmoreland insisted that after the attacks, the airfields themselves would increasingly become targets, and that the Army of the Republic of Vietnam couldn't adequately protect them. And so he needed, U.S. combat troops, not for offensive measures, but for defensive measures to protect the airfields. So on March 8, 1965, 2 battalions of Marines landed at Danang, the first combat troops. Again, their mission was at this point still sort of defensive more than offensive to protect the airfields, but they were U.S. combat troops. And I should note that throughout the remainder of the war, Da Nang was an entry point for many American troops coming to Vietnam. By the way, the first troops are met by South Vietnamese girls with flowers, an ironically happy beginning for what would be a horrible end. As the bombing increased, as Westmoreland was correct, the attacks on the airfields increased, and Westmoreland asked for more troops. And in time, it became obvious that they were just sitting there waiting to be attacked, and the United States combat troops should take the offensive. And so, in 1965 to 1968, you're going to see efforts to offensive military efforts increase. You're going to begin to see what they call search and destroy missions. And intelligence reports would say there was enemy activity, and the helicopters would fly soldiers in, and they'd sort out the enemy and destroy them, and then the helicopters would come pick them up again. The search and destroy missions were deadly. The helicopters would land and the Americans would fan out looking for the enemy, but the enemy had built some tunnels, and these were not just casual tunnels. They were impressive tunnels. You can see on the bottom left here, the one entry to the tunnel was an air pocket under a lake. They had supplies and ammunition, all they needed there, and Americans didn't know where they were. They would pop up and then vanish. And today, if you go to North Vietnam, as a tourist, you can see some of these tunnels. The National Liberation Front would have all sorts of booby traps set where someone could trip over a tripwire and there'd be an explosion, or simply step in something that would crush them. So, like I say, these search and destroy missions were quite deadly. In time, the systematic bombing of North Vietnam became known as Rolling Thunder, massive B-52 saturation bombings. They were intended to force Hanoi to try to negotiate peace, but they were also later on certainly just punitive. The U.S. was just ticked off. They originally maintained certain areas that were off limits, but later on there's nothing off limits. Of course, with the increasing rolling thunder and the bombings, there are going to be more and more people shot down. and more prisoners of war, POWs. And the American pilots would float down in their parachutes, and some of them would hope that the North Vietnamese troops would get to them because the villagers would attack them, angry over the bombing, and could kill them. But when they were caught, they were sent to really incredibly harsh prisoner of war camps, and there was a lot of torture. People were forced to sit on a platform where you had to make an effort to keep your head up, and otherwise the blood would go to your head. There was sleep deprivation. They put a bar behind your arms, all sorts of traditional torture devices. People were forced to sign confessions, and some soldiers actually knocked themselves unconscious to end the pain. One of the more famous of the, or I should say infamous of the prisoner of war camps was known by the American prisoners as the Hanoi Hilton. There were instances when the North Vietnamese would get Western press to come to the a press conference where the American prisoners of war were dragged out and told that they were being treated well. And there was one instance when one of the American pilots was saying the script that the North Vietnamese had given him, but he was tapping with his eyes Morse code that spelled torture. Overall, the United States dropped an average of 800 tons daily between 1965 and 1968. That is incredible when you look at it this way. That was 3 times the tonnage that was dropped in all of Europe, Africa, and Asia during World War II. 3 times the tonnage. From 1965 through 1968, Johnson just kept increasing the troop levels at the behest of General Westmoreland. Johnson famously said, I feel like a hitchhiker in a thunderstorm on a Texas highway. I can't run, I can't hide, and I can't make it stop. By the end of 1965, there were almost 200,000 U.S. troops. A year later, at the end of 1966, there were 400,000. By then, in 1967, there were 500,000 U.S. troops. That's more troops than were in the Korean War. And Westmoreland kept pushing for more. And of course, the casualties increased proportionally. The U.S. had begun to mine North Vietnamese ports. And all this is going on from 65 to 68. It's like we're responding. The United States was responding. It wasn't acting proactively, debating what the goals or the end result should be. It was an incremental increase in response to things that were happening, and no one knew how to make it stop. Finally, on January 31st, 1968, there was a turning point, the infamous Tet Offensive. It was January 31st was the Vietnamese New Year of Tet, and so they called it the Tet Offensive. On that day, there was not only an attack from the North Vietnamese Army, but the National Liberation Front, or the Viet Cong, rose up in a massive, well-coordinated assault on numerous towns throughout South Vietnam. The Tet Offensive included attacks on more than 100 district towns and a number of provincial capitals, as well as more than a dozen American military bases in South Vietnam. There was even an attack on the American embassy in the South Vietnamese capital of Saigon, a suicide attack that broke into the interior complex and just shot up a bunch of American diplomats and soldiers. The Tet Offensive was a turning point, as I say, not because of the military, but because of the way the attack was perceived. Every attack was repulsed, and Westmoreland proclaimed in a press conference that 37,000 communists had died, and the enemy's on the ropes. The Tet Offensive was a profound failure, that Westmoreland said. The problem was that the news media emphasized, the staggering breadth of this attack and the American and South Vietnamese casualties. The United States citizens had been told that America was winning the war. And this seemed to suggest that if America was winning a war, how the heck are they able to performed this massive assault, including an attack on the American embassy. It didn't sound like America was winning after all. And so the weeks after the war, a number of newspapers and periodicals ran editorials saying America should get out. Even the Wall Street Journal, Newsweek, and Time magazine all ran new editorials saying America needed to negotiate and get out. By the end of 1968, Johnson's approval ratings had slipped to 35%. Even the respected CBS newsman Walter Cronkite had said that victory wasn't likely, and LBJ said, "If we've lost Walter, then it's over." LBJ is going to decide not to run again, and that's going to throw Vietnam into the 1968 election. But this concludes the section on the very critical period from 1965 to 1968, when America's presence really dramatically expanded into a super quagmire.